What are some ideas that you learned from SLUH that you still take with you or live by even today?
Well, one of the biggest things is how to formulate relationships with people, how to maintain relationships, and how to work with people in different settings, different sorts of environments. Because once you get out of SLUH and you go out into the real world, so to speak, you come across a wide cross-section of people. When you're at SLUH, for the most part, you're with a lot of kids who are more or less like you, have similar backgrounds, things like that. But when you get out, in the world, going to college, having a job, a career, family, things like that, you realize that there's a lot of other different people that you're going to have to work with, get along with. Some, you just might not see eye to eye with, but still, you have to find a way to get along, coexist, and try to thrive as much as possible. And I think forging those relationships and trying to see the good, the bad, and the various sides of people is one of the biggest things that I learned.
All right. So, what do you remember most about high school? Are there certain events that you just remember today?
I remember, demerits. I remember, being in classrooms, getting in trouble, Mr. Zinselmeyer's office, from time to time. But, fortunately, it was few and far between on some of those things. But the biggest thing that I always remember about SLUH, and I still tell people, about this a lot when they're talking about whether or not they're going to send their sons to SLUH or whether or not, they've had some experience with the high school. I tell them that it's really about the community of people that you're with. And as opposed to, some other school, and, many times if you're comparing a public school to something like you get at SLUH, you get this community, this atmosphere, this overall environment that just doesn't exist, I don't think, at other places. And I think, the friends that I've made at SLUH are still my friends today. And, there's other places that you can't say that about because I think you connect with people at a certain time of your life when you're in high school, and especially at a place like this that helps to advocate and foster those relationships is something that is pretty unique to this place.
So are there any classes or any teachers that you really remember from here?
Sure, yeah. I remember, Mr. Schulte, who was my speech teacher, and one of the reasons I actually got into the business that I'm in now, because I think it was during a speech class or a public speaking class that we were having at the time, and he said that something to the effect of that he liked my voice. He thought that I had, a natural ability to speak in front of people, and it seemed like I enjoyed it, and maybe I should consider making a career out of it, or at least pursuing it in college and seeing where it goes. And that's really the first time I even thought about it. So that obviously stands out. Also, I would have to say Mr. Kornfeld stood out because he was my freshman basketball coach. I know he was, a longtime football coach, but he was my freshman basketball coach. And what I always remember about him is at the end of every practice, he would take these crazy half-court shots that he had no way of ever making. But he would say that if he made it, we were done with practice. If he missed, we'd run sprints. And he was never going to make them because he was shooting backwards. He was, throwing it over his shoulder. So he was always going to miss. And so we ended up doing sprints all the time. That always stuck out as well. And then Mr. Nicolarot, who was my typing teacher at the time. I mean, we took typing back then. We had actual typewriters. Makes it sound like from the 1920s these days. It's so bizarre. But yeah, he was my typing teacher, but also my baseball coach. And so, I spent a lot of time with him, and he actually lived by us when I was going, to SLUH back in those days. So, I'd have to go over to his house every once in a while. He'd drop me off after baseball practice. So we had a pretty close relationship. So yeah, there's, some of those teachers that, I still remember today that, had a pretty big impression on me.
Yeah, and he's still here today. He teaches computer fundamentals, some computer classes, and he still coaches the baseball team.
Yeah, the fact that he evolved from the typewriters to computers, says a lot about, his ability to adapt, I guess, huh?
Right.
Yeah.
So where did you go to college after SLUH? Where did you end up, and what area of study did you?
I went to Mizzou, and I started in broadcast journalism because that's kind of what they're known for. But at the time, I also started working, as a freshman there at a small radio station in Boonville, Missouri, which is about 25 miles west of Columbia. And what I'd really wanted to do was play-by-play, and I got a job there doing football and basketball for the local high school football and basketball team. And that actually took up a lot of my time in terms of preparing and doing the games, and I'd have to drive, probably half hour to every game. And because the broadcast journalism school was so demanding in terms of, just the curriculum, I sort of, at that time, prioritized getting the experience, the real life experience of being on air broadcasting, troubleshooting, the trial and error of trying to figure out how to do it. I put that as a higher priority than just getting a specific degree. So I switched over to the radio, TV, communications department. So I was still able to get a degree in that, but yet that took up less time just in terms of pure academics, allowed me to also get the experience at the radio station. Then I think a year or two in, I worked at another radio station as well. So I was juggling both of those jobs as well as going to school. And that's what really sort of, helped me get on the path to, making a career out of it.
So you had a couple chances to get behind the mic and just...
Right, which was the biggest thing about it. I mean, no matter what you do, whether, you go to a specific college, study a certain, for a certain degree, it really doesn't matter. It's really the experience, as opposed to other degrees. Let's say if you're going to become a lawyer or an accountant or something like that, where you have to, pursue a specific degree and have a certain level of knowledge that you can only get in a classroom. That's one thing. But in this business, it's kind of like, acting or performing to a degree. You have to get the reps. You have to get the actual experience if you're going to really make it. The classroom can only take you so far. So that is such a big priority in a business like this compared to something different. So I think in that regard, it was really important to do it early and often because, there was a lot of people that were my age who didn't get those jobs until after they got out of college. So I was, in a sense, a couple of years ahead of them in terms of my advancement. And, I had made a lot of my mistakes and sort of learned how to do it right. And so I was able to, I think, move along in my career a little quicker than some others who maybe waited longer to get that first job.
So I guess that's when you realized that you first wanted to become a broadcaster, I guess, when you had the two jobs at the radio station. Is that... And you wanted to do play-by-play too? Right.
At the time, I wanted to really do games and sort of like figure out, how to do them as well. Because, that was the first time I had really been on air when I was a freshman in college and got that job at the, the radio station. And I listened back to some of those tapes and I could tell I had no idea what I was doing. I had a general sense. But, it's not until you do it, you listen back, you start to figure it out along the way. And then it's just a matter of doing it time and again. It's like playing, a sport or an instrument or something. I mean, the first few times you're going to do it, you're not going to be as good as after you've done it, 50 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. It just takes repetition, time and again. And, it's one of those things. It's like a craft to where, because you're doing it, in a live environment, you can't just stop and correct yourself. It's not like if you're a writer, for instance, where if you're writing something, like that sentence, you erase it and start over again, and it's not your finished product. When you're doing a live game, like it or not, that's a finished product. Right. You may make some mistakes, you may not like things, and then, the next game you do, you can improve upon that, but everything that you do, every game, every instance you're on air is a finished product, so that's why it just takes repetitions time and again to get it right. Right.
So after your time in college, where did you go from there? What jobs did you get after you graduated college?
My first job coming out of college was working at a golf course because I didn't have a job. It was funny. Like I graduated college actually in 3.5 years, which probably was a mistake. I probably should have stayed and enjoyed the college experience a little more, but I was just ahead on some of my credits. I got out in December, so it was kind of an awkward time to try to find a job that I wanted. So I was just, working at a pro shop at a golf course, while I was looking and spent a few months there. First job I got was doing play-by-play for a minor league hockey team. After that, I ended up moving back to St. Louis and I got a job at a radio station, and it was actually in sales. It wasn't in broadcasting, but I had no interest in sales whatsoever. And, to be honest, I don't even know if I sold a single thing. It was really an entry point. Because, I knew what I wanted to do, and jobs were so hard to come by. So what I did was I took this job that sort of got me in the door, and once I was there, it goes back to the relationship thing. I made relationships with people who worked at the station. I was able to then sort of slide over, start doing some on-air work with them little by little. I added to that. And eventually I was able to turn what became kind of like a side part-time gig on air there into a full-time thing, left sales, and they were glad to get rid of me because, again, I probably didn't sell anything. Started doing the broadcasting full-time, at the radio station, and then one thing leads to another. After that, I was on air with, the Cardinals a little bit, with the Rams, the Blues, started, working for some places, outside of St. Louis, moved to Los Angeles, worked for Fox for a little while. Eventually moved back to St. Louis, worked for a short time for CBS, and now I've been with NBC for a long time. And that's sort of in a nutshell, how things develop from there.
All right. So, how did the NBC Sports crew recognize you with your job at Fox and your prior jobs to hire you there? Or what was your how did you break through to get that job, basically? Did they come to you or you go to them?
No, it was, to be honest, when I first started working for them, it was only on a couple of different events. It wasn't like it was all of a sudden, boom, I moved from one job to the next job. It was sort of, I think it was a couple of individual Olympic-oriented events. I think cycling and some skiing and a couple of other things that I did for them. And it wasn't like a full-time job or anything like that. It was just a couple of one-offs. Mm-hmm. And then they added to it. And they said, well, let's do this, and, asked me to do some more events. And eventually it grew into, the full-time endeavor that it is now. But it was just something that I think, when we talked to them, it wasn't something where they had reached out to me when I was at Fox or any place like that. I think it was just a connection that was made through a producer at the time that I was working with on a specific event or two, and that's how we got together. And then the relationship grew from those first few events I did for them.
All right. So, what was the first major sporting event that you did? Like something on national TV. What was the very first? If you remember.
Yeah, I would say, probably the biggest thing I remember doing for the first time on network TV was the Olympics back in 2012 in London. There was probably a few things I had done before that, maybe a one-off here or there. But, the thing I remember about London was the fact that it was my first Olympics. And I was doing the show that was the very first show of the Olympics for NBC. It was on a Saturday morning. The opening ceremony had been the night before. And so, NBC comes on the air Saturday morning, and I was doing that show. It was the men's road cycling event, which was, one of the premier events of the opening weekend. And it was the first event. And so they opened up their coverage with it. And I just remember that because it was such a big deal to the network, and it was a huge platform, and they knew they were going to get a huge audience, and that was the first time that I remembered thinking that this is a huge platform reaching a lot of people. It's significant to the network and to a lot of people that are putting this event on. So again, there may have been something before that I'm missing, but that was the first time that it really struck a nerve in me in terms of the significance of the platform and the network.
Okay. So how do you deal, if you're on live TV, how do you deal with making a mistake, or how do you handle stressful situations?
If you make a mistake, you basically just have to move on. You can't really dwell on it too much. You can go back to it later when you're off the air, but there's just really no time because you're still live, you're still in the moment. And what I always try to do is think about how everything's coming across to the viewer, because what you want ideally is to present them with something that seems relaxed, conversational, something that just connects with them in an easygoing manner. So if you're worked up, if you're nervous, if you're stressed, that's going to come through, and that's going to translate to the viewer, who's going to say, wow, this seems really weird, this seems off, bizarre, whatever the case may be. So I think what I always tell people, when they ask is you just try to have command of the situation. Try to be, have a calm in-command presence over the situation so that you're kind of ready for anything, and you do it just sort of in a relaxed, straightforward approach. I mean, you have fun with it, you enjoy it, and you kind of it's not like you're totally serious about everything, but at the same time, the more, kind of like we're having this conversation now, the more relaxed, conversational, and natural you are, and the more you're just being yourself as opposed to trying to be a broadcaster or trying to imitate somebody or, be like somebody else, that's where things can really kind of get sideways. But the more you're naturally yourself, you're projecting your personality, letting that personality come through while making sure, everything's buttoned up, T's are crossed, I's are dotted, things like that, and you're in command of the situation. That's when things are usually at their best.
What do you think your strengths are as a broadcaster? What has broadcasting helped you in like real life conversations, stuff like that? How has that helped you?
How has broadcasting helped me in real life?
Yeah, like just having a conversation with people, or even doing this. How has broadcasting helped you?
I mean, I would say that you get used to talking a lot, first of all. So because a lot of times you're doing, I did some shows at the Olympics where we were on the air for 6 to 8 hours. So you can make stuff up quick. And I'm not talking about making things up out of thin air, but you come up with ideas, things to talk about, conversation pieces. So, when you're having a conversation with somebody, or, you're dealing with somebody, I don't know, if you're buying something at the grocery store or somewhere where you're bargaining with people, I don't know, whatever the case may be, you learn how to interact, and you can, have conversations and steer them in a certain way. And, you're able to react to people because, one of the key things is, over the years, I've worked with a lot of different analysts. So I can't even tell you how many different broadcasters I've worked with that have been my analysts. So, one of my jobs is to always try to make them look good, set them up, ask them questions, take them, down certain roads where they can comment on things. So, I've learned to try and, find a way to always connect with people and develop some chemistry pretty quickly, because when you go on air with somebody for the first time, and there's been a lot of first times with me and other partners, you don't have a long time to develop chemistry, and you got to try to find a way to do it in a very short amount of time. So I think that's one of the biggest things that, where it's helped me, is being able to relate to people, connect to people that I might not know, and do it in a shorter time than it would typically take.
So as a broadcaster, I know you've broadcasted lots of games over your career. Are there any teams that you've really grown attached to? Any teams that you now like that you never did or even dislike?
It's funny because a lot of people say they do, but I actually don't. It's gone the other way. I for some reason, since I've been in this business, I have not gravitated to a certain team or had a certain allegiance, and I don't know if it's just because I've done so many different sports across, and covered so many different teams over the years. I don't know if it's just try to, remain neutral or what it is, but I tend to just enjoy the moment, and hope for a good game or an event, whatever I'm doing. If it's a tournament, if it's a game, whatever the case may be, I just hope it's close. I hope it's entertaining, because as a broadcaster, the last thing you want is a blowout or something that's just dull or played badly, because then it makes it tough. People aren't interested, and you're trying to come up with things to talk about to keep people interested. The best thing is when you have a good, close game that's well played, and you can enjoy it too, along with everybody else. So that's what I tend to, root for the most and hope I get. I will say this, I've become, more fans of individual athletes than I have, specific teams. And I've always been, a big soccer fan. I played soccer growing up, and, I've always, I find myself these days, I like European soccer. I watch a lot of European soccer, and, the likes of Messi, Ronaldo, and, some of the top teams like Real Madrid and Barcelona, things like that, the English Premier League. I appreciate that, for its skill level and some of the individual players more than, getting attached to an individual team.
So far, what has been your favorite sport to broadcast? What do you enjoy broadcasting the most of?
I don't have one sport that stands out clearly above the other ones. The sports I probably like doing the most are, hockey, basketball, cycling. And the reason being because the pace of hockey, is just very exciting. And, there's always, usually some drama that it comes down to, towards the end. Every goal is exciting no matter what happens, for some reason. And there's just a general excitement about the sport of hockey. The thing about basketball, there's a lot of different ways, that teams can play and matchups and things that can make a game interesting. I really like that. And then with cycling, there's so many different storylines in terms of backstories of athletes and teams, and there's subtleties and nuances and tactics that people typically aren't aware of. And it's always fun to dive into some of those things and explain them to people who don't know much about the sport. So there's, I think the interesting thing for me about those sports is they're very different. And because of those differences, it's interesting to, have something that's based on just the adrenaline of the game, like a hockey or a basketball, and then, the individual stories and the tactics and the nuances of something like cycling. So, I like bouncing around from one, to the other, whereas I know some people may just want to do a specific sport. I don't like that. I like the freshness of going from one to the other.
So, in your time broadcasting, who do you think is the best athlete that you've ever broadcasted, basically? Like, that you watched and you were broadcasting?
Boy, that is a tough one, just because I've done so many. One single athlete.
Or groups of athletes.
Right. I would have to say... in doing hockey, I remember, I was doing, the World Hockey Championships one year, and it was a tournament in which Alex Ovechkin, had like a ton of goals, and some were really spectacular. So, he obviously stands out. In a lot of the skiing I've done, Lindsey Vonn is an incredible athlete and is probably going to go down as, maybe the greatest individual skier of all time. In the next year or two, she'll probably end up with the most wins of anybody, female or male. She stands out. And beyond that, in basketball, I did do some work before. I did do a couple games, Michael Jordan was involved in. It was later in his career, so he wasn't at his peak, but still, just to be able to see him, still playing the game was pretty remarkable as well. So those are the ones that really jump out.
All right. So who do you think that the most famous, or not famous athlete, but have you gotten a chance to really meet any of these athletes? Have they ever come up to you and introduce themselves to you?
Well, they don't really know me. I've met a lot of them just because, you do their games, so you talk to them ahead of time, things like that. So, so I've, met a lot of people over the years. Wayne Gretzky and, Michael Jordan, LeBron James. I've interviewed Tiger Woods a few times. So, being able to sort of meet them, it's more of a professional environment. So, you're not all, buddy, things like that. But, it's still, to be able to have that experience of interviewing them or talking to them or things like that is always pretty memorable. And of course your dad too. Because your dad was such a great soccer player. So that was, being able to meet him and talk to him was, one of the highlights, I'd have to say.
So in the future, what is your dream broadcast? Like, what is the event that you would like to broadcast in the future? Something like the Super Bowl, the World Series, something that you have not already done that's your dream to do in the future?
I've never really looked at it that way, to be honest. Like, I have to do this or I want to do that. It's really always been about, what opportunities have come along. For me, I'd have to say if somebody said, all right, just pick out one thing you want to do right now, and it's yours. I would probably have to say it would either be the Masters in golf or the World Cup in soccer. Those two.
So, I know you've explained like you go all over the world to broadcast the Olympics, all over the country. How do you juggle your job of going everywhere and family time? How do you juggle spending time with
It's hard. It's the hardest thing I have to do, to be honest. And it's never right. It's never perfect because there's never that ideal balance. And, I've talked to other people about this too that are in the business. Even coaches and athletes tell me the same thing. It's, when you're away from home, you feel like you should be at home. When you're at home, you feel like maybe you should be working. There's never the right amount of time in both places. So, what I try to do is just maximize my time, in both places. When I'm home, I try to, make sure, with the kids and my wife and everything, that we spend time together and have a good time. And, I'm not dealing too much with work. And when I'm at work, I make sure that, I try to devote all my energy there as well. But you just, so much of it is schedule oriented, and you can't fully control the schedule. I try to, piece my schedule together and craft it in a way that gives me enough time at home. But it, like for instance, coming off this year where we had the Olympics, I was gone a lot leading up to the Olympics, then gone during the Olympics. And so there was just a big chunk of time where I was away. Whereas typically, it'd be nice to like be away for a week, be home for a week, be away for a week, be home. And it didn't work out that way. So now that, that's all behind me, I'm at home for a little while longer for, an extended period. This summer, I'll go to the Tour de France. That'll be a month in Europe, which, you never want to be gone for a month, but that's how long the event is. You can't just skip out halfway through. So, I try to carve out time ahead of the tour and then right after the tour to be at home. So I'm not going from one event, then for a month away, then coming back and jumping right back into something else. I try to piece it together as best I can, but the answer to your question is it's never perfect, and so you try to make peace with the imperfection as best you can.
All right, one final question. What advice would you give to any young students students that want to become broadcasters in the future? What advice would you give to them?
The best advice I could probably say is there's 3 things to always keep in mind. Number 1, always look for opportunities to get those repetitions that we talked about earlier. Just keep doing it because you think that, okay, well, I've done a few games, I got the hang of this, but there's always something else you're going to learn. Even if it's like one little anecdote or nugget of information or way of calling a certain play that might pop up in a game, that's valuable. So you take that into the next game, and all of these things will continue to add up. And, always, evaluate your performances, go back, listen, things like that. So, because you're really sort of like the master of your own career. You're the one that is the architect of how it's going to go, how it's going to develop. So, you want to be invested in that. Number 2, always be cognizant of the relationships you're making along the way, because you may be working with somebody who is a low-level assistant to the assistant producer at one point earlier in your career, and then later in their career, they may be in a position to hire you because they moved up the corporate ladder, and now they're working at a network. And if you had a good relationship with them, they're going to say, "Hey, Braden, come work for me," and do the NFL, something like that. Whereas if you didn't get along with them, or if you were a jerk to them somewhere along the way, they're going to say, "No way, I'm not hiring that guy." People have long memories in the business, so and it always obviously is good common sense to just be, kind and courteous on a regular basis, but just always be cognizant of the relationships you have. Always try to nurture them and, be good to people, because in this business in particular, people can't hold grudges. And so you want to make sure that, you're on the right side of that. And then just go where the opportunities take you. You never know where this business is going to lead. It's not like, going back to the accounting or the law analogy, where there's kind of like a linear path where, you work 2 years here, then you move up, then you make partner, and you can stay in the same firm, forever. This business can zig and zag in a whole lot of different ways, and you never know what one opportunity is going to lead to. So, don't be afraid to jump into something and be open-minded, because it can take you in directions that can really be fulfilling down the road. You just might not always recognize them in the moment. So you have to be open-minded and willing to do certain things to, eventually get to where you always want to go.
Oh, we have one more question.
Yeah. From the audience?
Yeah. Talk about your broadly publicized call of the Olympics gold medal this winter.
It was something that I didn't anticipate, because even though we went into that event and that broadcast knowing that it could be a significant moment, we didn't realize how the call was going to come off and then be received. We knew that it could be an historic event in terms of becoming the first ever medal in cross country for the U.S. women. But the way things played out, we had this confluence of circumstances that came together that allowed for the moment to become bigger than it might otherwise would have been, because it was a close race. It came down to the end. We had, Jessie Diggins, who was the U.S. skier, makes this late pass around this Swedish skier, lunges at the line to barely win the gold medal. Now, had she won a bronze medal in the first week, it would have been different. Had it not been a close race, it would have been different. Had she not lunged and got silver instead of gold, it would have been different. But because of all the things that I just talked about happening the way they did, it became this exciting moment. And, we just called it as we saw it. And my partner gets a lot of credit because he was just absolutely nuts and he kind of went bananas. And that's just the way he is, even though he's the most mild-mannered guy you'd ever want to meet. He coaches track at a small college in Duluth, Minnesota. So this is just a part-time job for him. But he, is so passionate about it. And he just went crazy. And I tried to just go along, with his excitement, but at the same time, making sure that I was calling the action properly. And then afterwards, we thought, hey, that was a great moment, but we had no idea the reaction we would get from various people and all of the interviews we ended up doing and, getting messages from not just in the U.S., but from around the world. I mean, we did interviews in Australia and New Zealand from people that heard it, and it really surprised me. I had no idea that it would get that kind of reception, and especially this day and age with social media, people tend to be more critical than giving their approval, and the level of enthusiasm that people had for this was really remarkable and something I didn't expect, but it was very much appreciated.
All right. Any more questions? All right. I want to thank you for your time again, and thank you.
Anytime, Braden.
No problem.
You got it.